A veteran Navy SEAL and his loyal dog discovered something impossible inside a coastal cave. A rusted submarine that had been missing for more than 50 years. But the mission logs inside revealed the Navy never told the real story. Soon, powerful people returned, determined to erase the evidence forever. Now one man and one loyal dog must decide if the truth should be buried again. Because some secrets stay hidden for decades, until the right moment reveals them. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to The Last Command K9. Summer arrived slowly along the northern coast of Maine, not with blazing heat, but with a quiet softening of the wind and the long gray skies that had lingered since spring. The Atlantic remained cold and restless, waves striking the jagged granite cliffs with a steady rhythm that echoed through the forest behind them. The land felt old here, older than the towns scattered along the coast, older even than the fishermen who had worked these waters for generations. Tall pine trees crowded the shoreline, their dark green needles whispering against the wind. Between the forest and the sea stretched narrow bands of rocky shore where tide pools formed when the ocean withdrew. It was a landscape both peaceful and severe, beautiful, but not gentle. Declan Voss had chosen this place because of that. At 43 years old, the former Navy SEAL had spent most of his adult life in environments far more dangerous than this one. War zones, covert operations, dark oceans beneath the hulls of ships. Those had once been his world. Now he lived in a small wooden cabin perched on a bluff overlooking the sea. The cabin itself was simple. Rough timber walls, a narrow porch, and a wood stove that crackled through the cold coastal nights. Declan had repaired much of it himself during the first months after moving in. The work kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. Declan was a tall man, just over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and compact strength that came from years of special operations training. His face was sharply defined, the jawline angular and strong. A light, uneven beard covered his jaw, giving him a rugged look that matched the weathered leather boots he wore every day. His eyes were a deep gray blue, steady and observant. People often noticed that about him first. They were the eyes of someone who rarely missed anything. Short, dark brown hair lay close against his head, cut in the practical military style he had worn for decades. At the temples, streaks of silver had begun to appear earlier than most men his age, a quiet mark left by years of pressure and responsibility. Declan dressed the same way nearly every day. A worn olive field jacket hung loosely over his shoulders, the fabric faded in places from salt wind and sun. Beneath it he wore a dark red and navy plaid shirt, thick enough to block the coastal chill. His dark cargo pants carried a folding pocket knife and a few practical tools, and on his wrist rested an old military watch with a faded fabric strap. Slung across his back whenever he walked far from the cabin was a sturdy backpack, an Eberly stock half-track, the kind designed for men who had once carried equipment across mountains and deserts. He rarely carried anything he didn't need, and he rarely said more than he had to. But Declan Voss was not alone. Walking ahead of him along the rocky shore that afternoon was a German shepherd named Titan. Titan was 8 years old, a working K9 who had served alongside Declan, of black and tan fur. The dark saddle of black and tan fur. The dark saddle of black across his back contrasted sharply with the golden fur along his legs and chest. His ears stood upright and alert, and his amber-brown eyes seemed constantly aware of the world around him. Titan did not wear a tactical harness anymore, just a simple dark leather collar. Yet the habits of a K9 never truly disappeared, even in retirement. Declan and Titan had developed a quiet rhythm together since leaving the military. Each afternoon, when the tide pulled back from the shore, they walked the same stretch of coast. Declan scanned the cliffs and horizon the way he had once scanned hostile terrain. Titan scanned everything else. They trusted each other's instincts. The tide that day had pulled unusually far from the rocks, exposing a stretch of shoreline Declan had rarely seen before. Jagged stone formations emerged from the water like the backs of ancient creatures. Titan moved ahead across the rocks, paws stepping carefully between tide pools. Then he stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. His body froze in place. His ears rose sharply forward, and his tail lowered into a rigid line behind him. Declan felt the change instantly. Anyone else might have missed it. But Declan knew that posture better than he knew his own reflection. That was not curiosity. That was a K9 alert posture. The same posture Titan had taken during operations when explosives or hidden enemies were nearby. Declan's expression tightened slightly. He walked forward slowly. "What is it, boy?" Titan didn't move. His eyes were fixed on a dark opening carved into the base of the cliff. A sea cave. The entrance was wide enough for a small boat, but shadowed so deeply that the interior disappeared into darkness. Waves rolled into the opening and echoed hollowly against stone. Declan followed Titan's gaze. There was nothing unusual at first glance. Just rock, wind, the steady breathing of the ocean. Declan crouched beside Titan, resting one hand lightly against the dog's neck. The shepherd's muscles were tense beneath his palm. Titan wasn't afraid. He was focused. Declan studied the cave. The tide had receded far enough that the water inside had lowered several feet. The exposed rock revealed an uneven stone floor stretching into the cave. Something about the place felt strange. Not dangerous, but wrong. Declan removed a flashlight from his jacket pocket and clicked it on. A narrow beam of white light cut through the darkness. The cave extended much farther than he expected. The light traveled across jagged stone walls slick with seawater. Then something flickered at the far edge of the beam. Something smooth, not stone. Declan narrowed his eyes and stepped forward carefully over the rocks. Titan followed close behind, silent now, but alert. The beam steadied. For a moment, Declan thought the reflection came from water. Then he saw the shape more clearly. A curved surface, metal, partially submerged. Declan frowned. It was too far away to identify clearly, and the cave swallowed much of the light before it could reach the object. He adjusted the beam. The reflection returned. A dull gray curve beneath layers of rust and salt. Declan lowered the flashlight slightly. He had spent years around ships, submarines, and steel hulls beneath the ocean's surface. His instincts recognized the shape before his mind fully processed it. Metal that large didn't belong in a cave. Titan took 2 slow steps forward. Then the dog stopped again. He sniffed the air once, sharply. A low sound escaped his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a bark. Declan watched him carefully. Titan was smelling something faint. Declan inhaled. At first he caught only the scent of salt water and algae. Then something else drifted faintly through the air. Oil, old oil, the kind used in machines. Declan's eyes slowly returned to the dark curve at the far end of the cave. For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. The sound of the ocean filled the silence. Finally, Titan gave a single sharp bark. Not loud, just once. A warning. Declan lifted the flashlight again and aimed deeper into the darkness. The beam traveled farther this time, far enough to reveal more of the object. More of the curved metal surface, more of the enormous shape hidden in the cave. Declan felt the muscles in his back stiffen. Whatever that thing was, it was far larger than he had first thought. And it did not belong here. The next morning arrived under a pale gray sky. Along the northern coast of Maine, dawn rarely burst across the horizon the way it did farther south. Instead, the light seeped slowly through the fog, rolling in from the Atlantic, turning the ocean into a dull sheet of silver. Declan Voss stood on the small wooden porch outside his cabin, a metal mug of black coffee warming his hands. The ocean lay 200 yards below the bluff, its surface restless even in calm weather. Titan sat beside him. The German shepherd's posture was upright, watchful. His dark saddle of black fur ran along his back like a shadow, fading into the golden tan of his legs and chest. The dog's ears flicked occasionally at distant sounds. Seagulls, wind through the trees, the low roar of waves. Declan had barely slept. The image from the cave had followed him through the night. Metal, curved, massive, and hidden in a place no ship should ever be able to reach. Declan had spent years around naval vessels, underwater hulls, and military hardware. Even in poor light, his instincts had recognized what he'd seen. But recognizing something and understanding it were two different things. He finished his coffee and looked down at Titan. Ready to check it again? Titan's tail moved once against the wooden planks. That was answer enough. The walk back to the stone cove took about 20 minutes through a narrow trail that wound between tall pine trees and thick patches of coastal brush. Declan carried his Eberle stock half-track backpack again. Inside were a few practical tools: rope, gloves, a waterproof flashlight, and a small handheld camera he used for documenting unusual finds along the coast. Nothing dramatic, just habit. The trail opened onto the rocky shoreline where the cliffs dropped sharply toward the sea. The tide had retreated farther than it had the day before, exposing long stretches of stone normally hidden beneath the water. Pools of trapped seawater reflected the sky, like shattered mirrors. The cave entrance stood ahead of them, cut deep into the cliff face like a dark wound in the rock. Titan moved faster now, trotting across the uneven stone with confident steps. But when he reached the cave entrance, the dog slowed, his ears tilted forward again. Declan noticed immediately, not alarm, but heightened attention. He stepped inside. The air inside the cave felt colder, thick with the smell of salt, seaweed, and wet stone. Waves rolled gently into the cave mouth, but the deeper interior remained quiet, insulated from the wind outside. Declan clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. The metallic surface appeared sooner this time, and closer. The object filled more of the cave than Declan had realized the day before. He moved carefully over the slick rock. Titan followed, stepping lightly beside him. As they approached, the flashlight beam revealed the shape in full. A cylindrical hull. Smooth steel plates riveted together. Stepped closer. Now there was no doubt. It stepped closer. Now there was no doubt. It was a submarine, not a small research craft. A real submarine. The hull lay tilted slightly to one side, partially submerged in dark water pooled at the back of the cave. Sections of faded naval paint still clung to the metal. Declan ran the flashlight along the length of the hull, at least 40 feet visible, maybe more disappearing into the deeper water. His mind started assembling possibilities automatically. Military. Cold War era, maybe. Too old for modern construction, and far too large to have entered this cave in its current state. Declan lowered the beam and studied the entrance behind them. The cave mouth was barely wide enough for a fishing boat. A submarine hull like this should never have been able to pass through, which meant one thing. The cave had changed. probably decades ago. A rockfall, or slow erosion, sealing the entrance after the vessel was already inside. Declan circled the hull slowly. Titan approached the metal surface again, nose low, sniffing along the rusted plates. The dog's movements were methodical, professional. He paused near a seam in the hull and inhaled deeply. Then his ears twitched. Declan crouched beside him. "You smell it too?" The faint scent reached Declan again. Not strong, but unmistakable. Machine oil, old oil, buried beneath decades of salt water and corrosion. Declan straightened slowly. A submarine that old should have been documented, recovered, or at least searched for. Yet he had never heard of any missing submarine along this stretch of coast. He lifted the flashlight again and examined the side of the hull. There, near the bow, faded lettering barely visible beneath corrosion. Declan brushed away a patch of wet algae with his glove. The metal beneath revealed the ghost of painted numbers. But most of the marking had been eaten away by time. Titan suddenly stepped away from the hull. His posture changed again. Not fear, alertness. The dog stared toward the deeper section of the cave. Declan followed his gaze. The water at the far end was darker than the rest of the cave, almost black in the weak light. The submarine continued into that darkness. Declan couldn't see the full length, just the front half. Something about the stillness there made the back of his neck tighten. He stepped onto a slanted section of rock and shined the flashlight farther into the cave. The beam reflected briefly on water, then vanished. Titan remained motionless, watching. For several seconds, the cave held nothing but silence. Then Titan did something unusual. The dog walked directly to the submarine's hull and placed one paw against the metal surface. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood there, listening. Declan watched him carefully. Titan had been trained to detect explosives, human scent, and mechanical vibrations. The dog tilted his head slightly, then slowly pulled his paw back. Declan frowned. "Feel something?" Titan didn't respond, but the dog's eyes remained locked on the dark water surrounding the submerged section of the submarine. Something unseen had caught his attention. Something that didn't belong to wind or tide. Declan felt a faint ripple of unease pass through him. Not fear. Just the quiet instinct that something deeper inside that cave had not yet revealed itself. He forced the thought aside. Focus first. Speculate later. Declan moved closer to the side hatch. The circular metal door was partially open, jammed at an awkward angle as if someone had tried to force it years ago. Rust had fused parts of the hinge together. Declan leaned down and shined the flashlight inside. The interior of the submarine was dark, cramped, and filled with stagnant water up to knee height. Old wiring hung from the ceiling. A metal ladder descended into the lower section. Declan considered going inside. But without proper lighting or breathing gear, it wasn't smart. Instead, he pulled the small camera from his pack and began documenting the exterior. Photographs, angles, markings, evidence. Titan remained near the waterline, occasionally sniffing the air or scanning the cave entrance behind them. Even here, the dog remained aware of their surroundings. Declan finished photographing the hull and returned to the cave mouth. Outside, the tide had begun creeping slowly back toward shore. They had maybe an hour before the water filled the cave again. He turned once more toward the submarine. Whatever it was, however it had arrived here, it had been hidden for a very long time. And something told Declan Voss that this discovery was only the beginning. "Let's go, Titan." The German shepherd followed him out of the cave, but not before glancing back once more toward the darkness behind the submarine. The discovery refused to leave Declan's mind. For most of the afternoon after leaving the cave, he tried to focus on ordinary tasks, repairing a loose railing on the cabin porch, checking the small generator behind the shed, sorting through supplies in his storage room. None of it worked. His thoughts kept returning to the same image. The curved steel hull, rust streaks, the faint smell of oil trapped beneath decades of salt water, and the unsettling silence inside the cave. Declan Voss had spent enough years around naval operations to know something important when he saw it. A submarine hidden inside a coastal cave wasn't just unusual. It was impossible, which meant there was a story behind it. And stories like that didn't disappear quietly. By late afternoon, Declan was driving the narrow coastal road toward the nearest town. The place was small, barely more than a fishing harbor with a handful of weathered buildings clustered around a wooden pier. The town had been here for generations, long enough that its older residents remembered things official records sometimes forgot. Declan parked beside the docks. Fishing boats rocked gently against their ropes, their hulls creaking softly with the motion of the tide. Titan jumped down from the passenger seat and stretched his long legs before falling into step beside him. Several fishermen glanced at the German shepherd as Declan walked along the dock. Titan's posture, alert, disciplined, still carried the unmistakable bearing of a working dog. Near the end of the pier stood a man untangling a net beside a small trawler. Declan recognized him. Elias Boone. Boone was somewhere around 70, though the sea had carved deeper lines into his face than age alone could explain. His skin was darkened by decades of sun and salt wind. A gray beard spread unevenly across his jaw, and his shoulders remained broad despite his years. He wore a faded brown windbreaker over an old flannel shirt and heavy rubber boots, suited for long hours on wet decks. Elias Boone had spent nearly his entire life fishing these waters. If something strange had ever happened along this coastline, Boone would have heard about it. Declan approached slowly. Afternoon. Boone looked up from the net. His eyes were pale blue, sharp despite the wrinkles surrounding them. They moved first to Declan, then to Titan. The old fisherman nodded once. "That dog of yours keeps good watch?" Declan allowed a faint smile. "He's better at it than I am." Boone wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the rail of the boat. "What brings you into town?" Declan rested his forearms on the dock railing, looking out toward the open water. "Curious about something?" Boone grunted softly. "Curiosity gets people into trouble along this coast." Declan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched a gull glide low across the harbor before speaking. "There's a cave along the northern cliffs." Boone's hands continued. "There's something inside it." Continued. "There's something inside it." The fisherman looked at him again, longer this time. "What kind of something?" Declan met his gaze. "Steel." Boone's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The old fisherman stared out toward the horizon for several seconds before speaking again. I wondered if someone would eventually go looking. Declan straightened slightly. "You knew about it?" Boone shook his head. "Not exactly." He gestured toward the ocean. 40 years ago, maybe more. Storms used to hit this coast hard in the winter. Declan remained silent, letting the man continue. "During those storms," Boone said slowly, "people in town started hearing things at night." "What kind of things?" Boone rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "Metal." Declan frowned slightly. "Metal?" "Not like boats," Boone said. "Different sound. Deep, hollow." He tapped the wooden railing with his knuckle. like something big shifting against rock. Declan felt a quiet chill move down his spine. How often? Only during storms, Boone replied. Wind howling, waves smashing the cliffs, and sometimes you'd hear it underneath all that. Declan imagined the sound echoing through the cave. Steel moving slowly in darkness. Did anyone investigate? Boone snorted. Not a chance. He nodded toward the cliffs, far beyond the harbor. That cave's always had a bad reputation. Tides come in fast. Rocks collapse without warning. He shrugged. Most folks figured the noise was just stones grinding in the surf. Declan watched the old fisherman carefully. But you didn't believe that. Boone gave a thin smile. After 70 years on the water, you learn the difference between rock and steel. Declan drove to the town library just before closing. Time. The building sat beside the harbor road, small and quiet, its white paint weathered by decades of sea air. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust. Titan lay patiently near the entrance while Declan walked between the narrow shelves. Most of the town's records were old newspaper archives, fishing reports, storm damage, shipwrecks, local politics. Declan spent nearly an hour flipping through microfilm records from the 1960s and early 1970s. At first, nothing stood out. Then a headline caught his eye. Navy searches for missing submarine. 1972. Declan leaned closer to the screen. The article was brief, incomplete, but it contained a name, USS Black Tider. Declan's pulse slowed as he read. The submarine had been part of an experimental naval program, a prototype designed to test a new sonar system capable of detecting objects at extreme distances underwater. The article explained that the vessel disappeared during sea trials off the coast of Maine. Official reports blamed a sudden storm. Search efforts lasted 3 weeks. No wreckage was ever found. Declan sat back slowly. He knew enough about military language to read between the lines. When a submarine vanished completely, the Navy rarely admitted uncertainty. Storms were convenient explanations. But submarines didn't simply disappear, not without leaving something behind. Declan copied the article onto his phone. Then he continued searching. Most of the remaining records were short follow-up stories, families grieving, naval statements, gradual fading of public interest. But one detail stood out. The sonar system aboard the Black Tider had been classified, and even decades later, the article said very little about what it actually did. Declan shut down the microfilm machine. Outside, the evening sky had darkened to deep blue. The harbor lights flickered on along the docks. Titan rose when Declan approached. The dog stretched once before walking beside him toward the truck. As Declan opened the driver's door, Titan suddenly froze. Not stiff, not aggressive, just completely still. The German shepherd's head turned slowly toward the ocean. Declan followed his gaze. Far out beyond the harbor, where the dark Atlantic stretched toward the horizon, something moved beneath the surface. Not a boat, not a wave, just a faint disturbance in the water. A long ripple. Then it vanished. Declan watched the empty water for several seconds. The ocean returned to its usual restless motion. Titan finally relaxed. But the dog climbed into the truck without looking away from the sea. Declan closed the door slowly. For the first time since discovering the submarine, a new thought crossed his mind. What if the Black Tider hadn't simply crashed? What if it had been hidden? The drive back to the cabin felt longer in the darkness. The forest road wound through thick pines where the headlights barely penetrated the shadows. Declan parked beside the cabin and turned off the engine. Silence of the woods settled around them. He stepped out and looked toward the distant cliffs. Somewhere out there, hidden inside stone and tidewater, the missing submarine still rested exactly where he had found it. A vessel officially lost to history, erased from records, forgotten by everyone except the ocean. Declan rested his hand briefly on Titan's back. "Well, partner," he murmured quietly, "I think we just found something the Navy stopped looking for a long time ago." Titan looked up at him. The dog's eyes reflected the porch light with a calm, steady intelligence. Declan turned toward the cabin door. Tomorrow he would go back to the cave again. But this time, he wouldn't just be looking at the submarine. He would be trying to understand why it had never been meant to be found. Morning arrived with a sharp wind blowing in from the Atlantic. The gray sky above the cliffs looked heavier than usual, the clouds layered thick like sheets of steel. Declan Voss stood beside his truck at the edge of the coastal trail, tightening the straps on his waterproof pack. Today was different. This time he wasn't returning to the cave alone. A woman stood nearby studying the cliffs through a pair of compact binoculars. Dr. Lila Mercer. She was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to long research expeditions. Her dark brown hair was tied in a low ponytail beneath a weatherproof cap. A few loose strands moved in the wind around a face marked by faint freckles and sharp, attentive eyes that seemed to measure everything she saw. Her clothing reflected practicality rather than style. A gray-green field jacket, a thick neutral-colored sweater, dark technical climbing pants, and worn hiking boots. She carried a narrow waterproof case slung over her shoulder, equipment for underwater recording. Lila Mercer was a marine scientist specializing in deep-water sonar mapping. Declan had contacted her the night before. When he mentioned a hidden submarine along the cliffs, she hadn't hesitated. Curiosity had overridden caution. Now she lowered the binoculars. "That cave entrance is tighter than I expected," she said. Declan nodded. "It wasn't built for submarines." She gave him a skeptical glance. "No caves are." Titan sat a few feet away, watching both of them calmly. The 8-year-old German shepherd's black and tan coat shifted in the wind as he scanned the tree line and shoreline with the patient vigilance of a trained working dog. Lila crouched briefly to study him. "Military K9?" "Former," Declan replied. Titan's ears twitched. Lila smiled faintly. "I can tell." The walk to the cave took longer with gear. Lila carried 2 compact diving tanks, lightweight enough for shallow coastal exploration. Declan carried the lights, rope, and waterproof tools. The tide had retreated again, exposing the stone path along the base of the cliffs. When the cave entrance appeared ahead of them, Lila stopped. The dark opening cut sharply into the rock wall. The Atlantic surged and retreated just outside it. She looked inside. Still hard to believe something like that sitting in there. Declan nodded toward Titan. "He believes it." Titan was already moving toward the cave. But when the dog reached the entrance, he stopped. His nose lifted slightly. He sniffed the air once. Then he stepped back and sat down outside the cave. Lila noticed. "He's not coming in?" "No," Declan said quietly. "Sometimes he stays where he thinks he's more useful." The scientist studied the dog again. "Smart animal." Inside the cave, the submarine looked even more massive than Lila expected. Her flashlight swept slowly across the hull. The curved steel surface was scarred by corrosion and barnacles, but the vessel's shape remained unmistakable. She exhaled slowly. "That's definitely military construction." Declan pointed toward the faded markings. "Black Tider." Lila knelt beside the hull, brushing away a thin layer of algae. The faint letters appeared again beneath the rust. Her eyes widened slightly. I've read about that vessel. Declan looked at her. You have? She nodded. It was one of the Navy's experimental sonar platforms in the early 70s. She ran her hand along the metal. Advanced technology for its time. Advanced enough to disappear, Declan said. Lila stood. Well, now we know where it ended up. They began preparing their dive gear beside the partially open hatch. The water level inside the submarine reached about waist height in the outer chamber. Beyond that, several internal compartments were fully flooded. Lila secured her breathing mask. We'll keep this short, she said. No, heroics. Declan nodded. Titan remained outside the cave entrance, lying on the stone ledge with his eyes fixed on the submarine. The interior of the submarine was colder than the surrounding cave. Their flashlights revealed narrow corridors, oars lined with pipes, cables, and rusted metal panels. Water drifted slowly through the lower sections. The silence inside the vessel felt heavy, as if the submarine had been holding its breath for 50 years. Lila moved carefully along the passageway. Her gloved fingers traced the remains of a sonar console mounted to the wall. This system was state-of-the-art back then, she murmured. Declan's light moved toward a ladder descending into another compartment. Most of the lower levels were completely flooded. They avoided them. Instead, they explored the upper corridor. Cabins, storage compartments, control stations. Most had been stripped bare by time and corrosion. But one thing stood out. Several internal doors were sealed shut. Declan tested one of the handles. It didn't move. Pressure locks, Lila said. Standard safety design. Declan shined his light down another corridor. Nothing but darkness. Then, a sharp bark echoed through the cave outside. Titan. Both of them froze. Another bark followed. Louder. Urgent. Declan turned toward the hatch. Something's wrong. They climbed out of the submarine quickly. Titan was pacing along the rock near the vessel. His posture had changed completely. Alert. Focused. The German Shepherd was staring at the submarine's outer hull again. But this time he wasn't sniffing. He was clawing, scratching repeatedly at a specific section of the steel. Declan walked toward him. What is it? Titan struck the metal again with his paw. The sound echoed hollowly. Declan paused. That section of the hull sounded different. He ran his knuckles across it. A dull metallic thud. Then a hollow echo. Lila stepped closer. That's not part of the main hull, she wiped away layers of algae and corrosion. A thin rectangular seam appeared beneath the growth. A maintenance panel, she said quietly. Declan frowned. Or a hidden compartment? For a moment, none of them spoke. Titan lowered his head and pressed his nose against the seam. The dog inhaled once, then looked up at Declan. Not barking, just staring. The kind of look trained K9 handlers recognize instantly. Human scent. Old, but still there. Declan felt the tension tighten in his chest. This compartment wasn't meant to be found. Lila's voice dropped to a whisper. And someone sealed it from the inside. The panel had been locked by a corroded mechanical latch. It took nearly 20 minutes of careful prying with Declan's multi-tool and a small crowbar from his pack before the metal finally shifted. With a grinding scrape, the panel door swung open. A narrow storage cavity lay behind it. Perfectly dry, protected from seawater. Inside were several sealed metal cases, Lila. A third container. Inside was a waterproof 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 container. Inside was a third container. Inside was a waterproof leather notebook. The cover was cracked with age. Declan flipped it open. The pages were yellow but preserved. Handwritten entries filled them. Dates, coordinates, technical observations. And then the final pages. Declan read silently for several seconds. Lila watched his face. "What does it say?" Declan turned the notebook so she could see. The final entry had been written in rushed handwriting. Mission log, final entry. The words beneath it were brief, uneven, almost desperate. Sonar system detected internal anomaly. Unknown signal inside vessel. Crew conflict escalating. Containment attempt failed. Declan's eyes moved to the final sentence. His voice was quiet when he read it. It wasn't the storm. Lila looked up. "What?" Declan closed the journal slowly. The submarine didn't sink because of weather. He held up the final page. It was attacked from inside. Outside the cave, the tide had begun creeping back toward the entrance again. Titan stood beside Declan and Lila, watching the dark interior of the submarine as if expecting something to move. The wind outside the cliffs had begun to rise. Declan slid the journal back into its case. Whatever had happened aboard the USS Black Tider in 1972. The official story had been wrong, and the truth had been hidden. Sealed inside a compartment no one was supposed to find. The story spread faster than Declan expected. Small towns had their own kind of communication network, one built on fishermen's conversations, quiet barroom talk, and the slow circulation of curiosity through grocery stores and harbors. Declan had not told many people about the submarine. Only Elias Boone and Dr. Lila Mercer. Yet within 2 days, the whispers had already begun moving through the town like wind through tall grass. Something strange had been found in the cliffs. A military vessel. Old, hidden, possibly dangerous. Declan noticed the shift the moment he stepped into the harbor diner one afternoon. The place was a narrow wooden building overlooking the docks, its windows fogged slightly from the smell of frying fish and coffee. Several men sitting at the counter turned their heads when he walked in. Not hostile, but curious. Too curious. Titan followed him quietly, the German shepherd's steady stride and focused eyes drawing just as much attention as Declan himself. Declan ordered coffee. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and the blunt efficiency of someone who had served fishermen her entire life, poured it without asking. "You're the one who found that thing in the cliff cave, right?" she said. Declan didn't answer immediately, but the room had gone quiet. That was answer enough. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You should be careful what stories you start around here." Declan met her eyes. "I didn't start the story." She gave a short nod. "No," she said, "but stories like that attract people." Declan understood exactly what she meant. That night, the wind rose sharply along the coastline. Declan's cabin stood alone at the edge of the forest, perched above the cliffs where the ocean could be heard crashing against rock even from a distance. Inside, the cabin was warm with lamplight. Declan sat at the small wooden table with the sonar tapes and the weathered mission journal spread open in front of him. Dr. Lila Mercer had returned to her research station for the evening, promising to analyze the recordings the next day. Titan lay near the door, his body stretched along the wooden floorboards. The dog appeared relaxed, but Declan had lived with him long enough to know the difference between rest and watchfulness. Titan's ears moved slightly at every shift in the wind outside. Declan continued studying the journal entries. Many of them were technical. Sonar calibrations, ocean depth readings, navigation adjustments. But the final entries grew increasingly erratic, shorter, more urgent, as if the crew had been documenting something they didn't fully understand. Declan ran a hand across his beard thoughtfully. Something about the situation still didn't fit. If the Navy had truly lost the USS Black Tider during a storm, why had no recovery mission ever found it? The cliffs weren't that remote. Search teams would have combed this coastline thoroughly. Unless Declan stopped. Titan's head lifted. The German shepherd's ears pointed toward the forest. Declan looked up. "What is it?" Titan stood slowly. No barking, no growling, just absolute attention. The dog moved toward the cabin window overlooking the tree line. His posture had changed completely, alert. Declan stepped beside him. Beyond the cabin clearing, the forest stretched into darkness. Tall pines swayed gently in the wind. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then, a faint glow appeared between the trees. Headlights. Declan narrowed his eyes. A vehicle. The beams moved slowly along the narrow dirt road that ran through the forest behind the property. Not a local truck. The lights were too steady, too deliberate. Titan gave a low, quiet rumble in his throat. Declan stepped back from the window and switched off the cabin lamp. Darkness filled the room. Through the glass, the vehicle became easier to see. A black SUV rolled into a small clearing deeper in the trees and stopped. Its engine shut off. The headlights remained on for several seconds. Then they went dark. Declan stood motionless. The forest returned to silence. Titan remained by the window, staring into the darkness long after the vehicle lights had vanished. Morning arrived with a colder wind. Declan returned to the cave earlier than usual. Titan moved ahead of him along the stone path exposed by the receding tide. The dog stopped halfway to the cave entrance. His nose dropped toward the rock. Declan approached slowly. "What do you smell?" Titan followed a scent trail along the wet stone. Declan crouched beside him. There it was. Footprints, fresh ones. The prints had been left by heavy boots, not fishing boots, tactical. Declan examined them carefully. They led directly toward the cave and back out again. Someone had already visited the submarine. Declan's jaw tightened. He stood slowly. Let's see what they were looking for. Inside the cave, nothing appeared immediately disturbed. The submarine remained exactly where they had left it. The hidden compartment had been closed again, but not carefully. Declan noticed the latch. Someone had opened it after they left. He felt the quiet weight of confirmation settle in his chest. They weren't alone in this discovery anymore. Declan was leaving the harbor later that afternoon when he saw the man waiting beside his truck. The stranger stood with calm confidence near the driver's door. He was tall, nearly Declan's height, with the straight posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform. His hair was silver gray, cut short in a military style, and his face was narrow with deep lines carved around the mouth and eyes. He wore a dark technical jacket over a navy sweater and simple dark trousers. No insignia, no uniform. But the presence was unmistakable. Titan stopped beside Declan. The German shepherd studied the man carefully. The stranger spoke first. "Declan Voss." It wasn't a question. Declan nodded slightly. "Depends who's asking." The man extended his hand. "Commander Nathan Hale, United States Navy. Retired." Declan shook it. The grip was firm, controlled. Hale glanced briefly toward Titan. "Good dog." Then his eyes returned to Declan. "I understand you've made a discovery along the cliffs." Declan crossed his arms. "People seem to understand a lot lately." Hale didn't smile. "The submarine you found is a matter of national security." Declan watched him carefully. "Funny thing about national security," he said. "It usually shows up before the rumors do." Hale's expression remained calm. "You've already seen enough to know the vessel is military property. And further interference would be unwise." The words were spoken politely, but the meaning behind them carried weight. Declan tilted his head slightly. "Are you here to take it back?" Hale looked toward the ocean. "No." Declan frowned. "Then, what are you here for?" Hale met his eyes again. "To ensure it remains undisturbed." Titan stepped forward suddenly. The German shepherd stood between Declan and the older man. Not aggressive, but deliberate. Hale looked down at the dog. For the first time, something in the retired commander's expression shifted. Recognition, not of Titan, but of the behavior. "You were Navy too," Hale said quietly. Declan didn't answer. Hale studied him for a moment longer, then spoke again. "The past doesn't always belong in the open, Mr. Voss." Declan held his gaze. Depends who buried it. Hale walked slowly toward the harbor road. Before entering his vehicle, he turned once more. The Black Tider disappeared for a reason. Declan watched him carefully. What reason? Hale paused, long enough to suggest the answer mattered. Then he shook his head. The kind that ruins lives when it's uncovered. The engine of Hale's car started. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the coastal road. Titan remained standing beside Declan. The German shepherd's eyes followed the departing car until it vanished. Declan exhaled slowly. He understood something now that he hadn't before. The submarine wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was evidence. Evidence someone had spent 50 years trying to keep buried. Declan rested his hand on Titan's neck. Well, he said quietly, I guess we just met the man who doesn't want us digging. Titan looked up at him. Calm, focused, as if the dog had already decided what came next. The wind died after sunset. By the time darkness settled over the coastline, the forest above the cliffs had become almost unnaturally quiet. Even the ocean seemed subdued, the waves striking the rocks below with a slower rhythm. Declan Voss stood on the wooden porch outside his cabin, watching the last line of pale twilight fade behind the trees. Inside the cabin, the sonar tapes and the worn mission journal from the USS Black Tider lay packed carefully inside a waterproof case. He had spent most of the afternoon debating what to do with them. Commander Nathan Hale's warning echoed in his mind. The past doesn't always belong in the open. Declan had heard that kind of reasoning before, during briefings, during deployments, during operations that had ended with things buried instead of explained. Sometimes secrecy protected people. Sometimes it protected mistakes. Titan stepped quietly out onto the porch beside him. The 8-year-old German shepherd's coat looked almost black in the moonlight, the tan fur along his legs and chest catching the faint silver glow from the rising moon. The dog stood still, listening. Declan noticed immediately. Titan's posture changed. His ears tilted forward toward the forest. Declan followed his gaze. The trees beyond the clearing were dark and still. At first he saw nothing. Then Titan gave a low, controlled growl. Declan leaned slightly toward the railing. Far beyond the tree line, through narrow gaps in the branches, a faint beam of light flickered once. Then again. Flashlights. Moving. Declan's expression hardened. They're early, he murmured. Titan looked back at him. Declan stepped inside and grabbed the waterproof case. If Hale intended to erase the submarine's secrets tonight, he wouldn't waste time. Declan clipped a small headlamp onto his jacket and checked the knife clipped inside his belt. He didn't carry firearms anymore. That part of his life was over. But experience had taught him something else just as valuable: patience. He looked down at Titan. Let's go. The forest path toward the cliffs was barely visible under the thin moonlight. Declan moved carefully between the pines, Titan trotting silently ahead of him. The dog paused often, sniffing the air, adjusting direction slightly each time. Titan wasn't following the trail to the cave. He was tracking the new scent. Human. Several humans. Oil, rubber, machine metal. Declan crouched beside him once. How many? Titan's nose remained low. Then he continued forward. Declan understood the answer. More than one. They reached the edge of the cliffs without being seen. From there, the narrow stone path descended toward the cave where the submarine rested inside the rock. Declan stayed in the shadows beneath the trees and looked down. The cave entrance was illuminated by several portable lights. 4 men stood near the waterline. One of them was unmistakable. Commander Nathan Hale. Even from a distance, his posture was rigid, controlled, his silver hair catching the white beam of the equipment lights. The other men wore dark tactical clothing, practical gear designed for quiet movement. None of them looked like fishermen. Declan studied their equipment: waterproof containers, portable generators, and something else. One of the men unpacked a long rectangular device, metal, heavy. Declan narrowed his eyes. A cutting torch. Titan shifted beside him. Declan rested a hand lightly on the dog's back. "They're going into the hull," he whispered. Below them, Hale spoke calmly to the team. Declan couldn't hear the words, but the gestures were clear. The men began preparing equipment near the submarine. They were planning to open the sealed compartment. The compartment where the sonar tapes and the mission log had been hidden. Declan's mind moved quickly. If Hale retrieved those recordings, the truth about the Black Tider would vanish again. And this time, no one would know where. "Look!" Declan leaned close to Titan. "We go around." Instead of descending directly toward the cave entrance, they slipped deeper into the forest. Declan knew another path. A narrow slope hidden behind the cliff face where rainwater had carved a steep channel through the rock. It was dangerous, but it led to the rear of the cave system. They moved quickly, but carefully. Loose stones shifted beneath Declan's boots as they descended through the narrow ravine. Titan climbed down beside him with quiet agility. At the bottom of the slope, the sound of the ocean grew louder again. The back side of the cave entrance opened into a narrow crevice where the tide had carved a second passage through the rock. Declan slipped through first. Inside the cave, the submarine loomed in the darkness, exactly where it had always been. The portable lights from Hale's team illuminated only the front half of the cavern. Declan and Titan approached from behind the hull where shadows remained thick. Quickly, he lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one. Declan worked quickly. He lifted the tapes out quickly. He lifted the tapes out one by one, placing them carefully into his pack. The old magnetic reels were heavier than they looked. Titan stood near the entrance of the hidden compartment, watching the illuminated section of the cave. Suddenly, Titan froze. Not barking, not growling, just completely still. Declan paused. From the other side of the submarine came the sound of boots moving across wet rock. Closer than before. One of Hale's men was walking around the hull. Titan slowly stepped backward into the shadow beside Declan. The dog's breathing remained slow and controlled. Declan switched off his headlamp. Darkness swallowed them both. The footsteps came closer. A flashlight beam swept across the metal hull. The light paused only a few feet from where they were hiding. Declan felt the quiet tension stretch through the cave. Then the beam moved away again. The man turned back toward the others. Titan exhaled softly. Declan rested his hand against the dog's neck. "Good boy," he whispered. Once the last sonar tape was secured, Declan sealed the hidden compartment again. From the other side of the submarine, sparks suddenly burst against the cave wall. Hale's team had begun cutting into another section of the hull. Declan understood immediately. They believed the recordings were still inside. That assumption would buy him time. He and Titan slipped quietly toward the rear crevice again. The tide had begun creeping back into the cave, thin streams of water sliding across the stone floor. Declan climbed through the narrow passage and into the night air beyond. Only when they reached the upper forest trail did he finally stop. The wind had risen again, moving through the tall pines with a low whisper. Declan removed the pack and checked the contents. Every sonar tape, every recording, still there. Titan sat beside him calmly. The German shepherd's sharp eyes scanned the dark forest behind them. Declan looked down at the dog. "You knew they were coming before I did." Titan's tail moved once against the ground. Declan closed the pack again. Far below them, the cave lights still glowed faintly against the cliff face. Commander Nathan Hale and his men would spend the next hour cutting open empty compartments. By the time they realized the recordings were gone, Declan and Titan would already be gone with them. Declan stood and adjusted the straps on the pack. "Let's go home," he said quietly. Titan rose beside him. Together they disappeared into the dark forest above the sea. The storm that followed that night lasted 3 days. Cold Atlantic rain swept across the cliffs in long gray sheets, washing over the forest and the narrow coastal roads that wound through the town. The sea grew restless again, waves crashing against the rocks with heavy force. Inside Declan's cabin, the storm created a strange kind of isolation. The outside world faded into wind and rain. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock and the soft shifting of Titan's paws across the wooden floor filled the quiet space. Declan Voss sat at the small table near the window, the waterproof case open in front of him. Inside were the sonar tapes from the USS Black Tider. Several reels of magnetic tape. The final mission log. Evidence that had been sealed inside a steel compartment for half a century. Declan leaned back in the chair. He had already considered the options. Hand the recordings to Commander Nathan Hale and let the Navy bury the truth again. Or release the information and allow history to judge what had happened. Titan lay beside the door, watching him. The 8-year-old German Shepherd had that steady patience that came from years of disciplined work. The dog didn't understand politics or classified operations, but he understood something else. When something hidden made people nervous. Declan ran a hand slowly across Titan's neck. "Sometimes the truth makes powerful people uncomfortable," he murmured. Titan blinked once, calm as always. Declan closed the case. The decision had already been made. 2 days later, Declan drove into Portland. The coastal city was larger than the fishing town near his cabin, busy with shipping docks and research vessels that moved in and out of the harbor. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clear and cold. Declan parked beside a quiet brick building near the waterfront. The office belonged to a man who had spent most of his career uncovering stories that powerful institutions preferred to keep quiet. His name was Daniel Cross. Daniel Cross was a thin man in his late 40s, tall but slightly hunched from years spent leaning over documents and computer screens. His hair had begun turning gray early, giving him a tired but thoughtful appearance. He wore round glasses and a dark wool coat that looked slightly too large for his narrow frame. But his eyes were sharp, restless, the kind of eyes that noticed details other people ignored. Cross opened the door himself when Declan knocked. "You must be Voss," he said. His voice carried the quiet intensity of someone who was always halfway through a question. Declan nodded. "You're the reporter?" Cross smiled faintly. "Investigative journalist," he corrected. Titan stepped quietly inside the office beside Declan. The dog paused just long enough to scan the room before settling near the door. Cross noticed him immediately. "That dog's seen things," he said. Declan didn't answer. Instead, he placed the waterproof case on the desk and opened it. Cross's expression changed the moment he saw the sonar tapes and the journal. For several seconds he didn't speak. Then he looked back up at Declan. "Where did you get these?" Declan met his gaze. "From the only submarine nobody ever found." Cross sat down slowly. "You realize what this could mean?" Declan nodded. "That's why I brought it to you." Cross carefully lifted the worn mission log. His fingers moved gently across the aged pages. This could rewrite an entire naval incident. Declan leaned against the wall. "Then, write it." The investigation took weeks. Cross worked with researchers, naval historians, and audio engineers to analyze the sonar tapes. The recordings were old, but the signals were still readable. The final transmissions revealed something the Navy had never admitted publicly. The Black Tider had not been lost in a storm. The submarine had detected a catastrophic flaw in its experimental sonar system. The technology emitted a powerful resonance wave. Under certain conditions, the wave reflected back through the vessel's own hull. The feedback destabilized critical equipment inside the submarine. Systems began failing. Crew members attempted emergency shutdown procedures, but the signal continued to amplify. The captain realized the vessel had become dangerous, not only to itself, but to nearby ships. The decision was made quickly. The crew evacuated. Explosive charges were triggered to sink the submarine before the experimental system could fall into foreign hands. The cave along the cliffs had simply been the closest place deep enough to hide the wreck. And over the decades, rockfall had sealed it inside. The mission had succeeded. The submarine disappeared. The story vanished with it. Until now. One evening, weeks after the investigation began, Cross called Declan unexpectedly. His voice carried a rare excitement. "We finished restoring the final audio recording," he said. "What kind of recording?" Declan asked. "Crew communications from the final minutes." Declan drove into the city again that night. Inside Cross's office, the reporter played the recording through a pair of studio speakers. The audio crackled with age. Voices filled the room. Naval officers speaking quickly, equipment alarms sounding faintly in the background. Then, near the end of the recording, another sound appeared. A sharp bark. Declan's head lifted. Cross paused the audio. "You heard that too?" Declan nodded slowly. "That's a dog." Cross rewound the recording and played the section again. A distant bark echoed through the submarine's corridors. Then, a voice spoke. "Captain, the K-9 unit just detected the resonance before the sensors did." The recording ended moments later. Declan stared at the speakers in silence. For 50 years, no one had known. But the last warning aboard the Black Tider had come from a dog. The story exploded across the country once the investigation was published. News outlets picked it up within days. The forgotten submarine, the experimental sonar technology, the hidden mission that had never been acknowledged. Under pressure, the Navy eventually released an official statement. The USS Black Tider had indeed existed. Its mission had been classified. The vessel had been intentionally sunk during a failed experimental operation to prevent the technology from spreading beyond American control. The cave where the submarine rested was soon declared a protected historical site. No recovery mission would attempt to remove it. The wreck would remain where history had left it, sealed inside the stone cliffs above the Atlantic. Commander Nathan Hale never contacted Declan again. Whatever role he had once played in protecting the secret was no longer necessary. The truth now belonged to the public. Several weeks later, the first warm morning of early spring arrived along the coast. Declan walked slowly along the rocky shoreline toward the cave. Titan trotted beside him, calm and steady as always. The tide had retreated far enough to expose the entrance. Sunlight reached deeper into the cave now, illuminating the rusted steel hull resting inside the rock. The submarine looked less like a mystery now, more like a monument. Declan stopped at the entrance. Titan stepped forward slightly, gazing at the dark silhouette of the vessel. For several seconds, the dog simply watched. No barking, no warning, just quiet attention. Then Titan sat down on the stone floor. Declan placed a hand gently on the dog's head. The morning sunlight touched the submarine's corroded metal, turning the rust into shades of deep orange and gold. History had tried to bury the truth beneath stone and water, but time had a way of uncovering what people tried to hide. Sometimes through historians, sometimes through journalists, and sometimes through a man walking along the coast with a loyal dog at his side. Declan looked out toward the open Atlantic. "Guess we did our part," he said quietly. Titan's tail brushed softly against the rock. The cave returned to silence, and the submarine remained exactly where it had always been. A secret once buried beneath stone, now part of history. Sometimes the truth stays buried for years, hidden under stone, under silence, under decisions made by people who believed the world was better off not knowing. But every now and then, something extraordinary happens. A moment, a discovery, a quiet act of courage, and the truth finds its way back into the light. Maybe that is not coincidence. Maybe that is grace. Because in life, there are times when we walk through darkness without understanding why we are there. We face unanswered questions, closed doors, and mysteries that seem too heavy to carry. Yet somehow, at the right moment, something shifts. A person appears, a path opens. A small sign reminds us we are not walking alone. Some people call it luck, others call it timing. But many believe it is something greater, a quiet reminder from God that even the things hidden for years can still be revealed when the time is right. Just like the story you have witnessed today. And maybe this story is also a reminder for our everyday lives that truth matters, that courage matters, and that sometimes the smallest companions on our journey can guide us to the greatest discoveries. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little reminder that light always finds its way through the darkness. Tell us in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, courage, and the unexpected ways truth returns to the world, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your path, and bring peace to your home and family. Thank you for being here.